There you go, right? That's right. That's right. Yeah, all the way down.
We thought we should take the load before you started. Yeah. Yeah, and I've been meaning to come. I've just been away. So it's not that we're here to heckle you or anything.
I just realised that I need my wife for one of these and they for some reason Alright, thank you.
Well,
Sorry.
yeah, we'll talk to you after.
Yes.
Plenty of seats at the front here. Yeah, no, I'm going to really wait. Not quite the front right now. You know, I actually did that deliberately. I knew nobody would sit here. Oh, he's got it.
That's pretty small scale here. Yeah, fair enough.
Small scale, yeah, very small scale. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, you're welcome to. All right, thanks for coming, everyone. Pleased to see such a good turnout tonight. Tonight we've got Dr. Peter Mitchell talking about geolocation and geovisualization. It should be a lot of fun. It seems like a popular topic. We've got a lot of RSVPs tonight, which is really great. If you haven't been along to Hacks Hackers before, I'll just do a little bit of a spiel about what it is and what we're doing. So it's a community organisation essentially. There's chapters of the organisation in cities all around the world. It started in New York, and the mission of the meetup groups is essentially to talk about the intersection of technology and storytelling or journalism. And we've been meeting here for every month since February this year. The group's actually been around a bit longer in Brisbane, but there was a bit of a hiatus last year. So we kicked it off again this year, and we've been meeting monthly, and we'll be doing so through till November. So we've got 3 more meetups this year after tonight, and it'd be great to see some of you along. As I said, it's a really community sort of led group, a community organisation, and Dan and I, who's up the back there restocking the drinks, thank you Dan, are sort of the main the organisers, but really we want it to be a real community. So if you can volunteer some time, if you can present or provide any other support, sponsorship, that kind of thing, it'd be really appreciated. We're always looking for people to do things like man the door, like Colin's doing down the back there. Thank you, Colin. So they lock the doors here at 6 o'clock, and we need somebody to open it up for when everyone arrives. So just little things like that. If you can volunteer and help us out, take photos, that sort of stuff, it'd be really appreciated. So come and talk to me if you're willing to do any of that. You can also participate online. We've got a few different spaces where we chat. Obviously, we love social media, so Twitter, that's the hashtag and the account if you want to talk to us or tweet about the events. We've just this month, I haven't got it on the slide there, but just this month we've also started a Facebook page, and we're putting events up on, all these events are going on Facebook as well as on the meetup.com website. So if Facebook's your thing and you want to promote the events there, that'd be really appreciated. And we've also got a community in Slack where it's not just this group of people, but storytellers and data-driven storytellers and developers who are kind of telling stories all around the world really, but mostly focused on Australia and New Zealand, kind of hang out in that group. And there's a few of us here who hang out there regularly, and it's a really good community. So come along, say hello. Next month, we've already got a speaker lined up, Randall, who's in the crowd here somewhere. Can't see where he is right now. There he is. So he's going to be talking to us about hackathons, what they are, and giving us a bit of a roundup and showcase on the GovHack hackathon, which was, there's been one held recently, but it's held yearly, I think. And Randall, I believe, was on a team that won one of the challenges two years in a row. Wow, impressive. So, and we'd love to have another presenter for next month as well. So if you're keen to put up your hand, want to talk about any projects that you've worked on or just a topic you're interested in, that'd be great. Come and see me or Dan. A huge thank you to all our sponsors. Every month this year we've had great support from these three sponsors principally. Hub 4101 gives us great event support. They help us organise RSVPs and do a great job promoting and give us other support as well. So they're a sort of community, a business group within the 4101 postcode who are promoting technology businesses in the area. So there's heaps of technology-based businesses in the area. It's a really kind of thriving area for that, and they want to make it more so. Venue is always wonderful for the ABC to provide this venue. It's really good. And last but definitely not least, the drinks and the pizzas that'll be coming later are provided by ThoughtWorks. We really appreciate that. So now, Peter, come on up. I won't do a big introduction. I'll let you introduce yourself, but thanks very much for talking to us. We're on.
Hey. Hi everyone. As Simon said, my name's Peter Mitchell. I'm from the Digital Media Research Centre at QUT. You're going to have to. I've got a bit of imposter complex because I'm neither a hack nor a hacker. I'm not a technologist and I'm not a journalist. In fact, my background is in literature or in digital humanities, going into sort of cultural heritage, digital culture. So where I started out with doing mapping and geovisualisation was a project that I did with a couple of colleagues at the University of Queensland called the Cultural Atlas of Australia. And this really was a sort of digital humanities cultural heritage project where we very painstakingly hand coded, hand mapped locations across about 200 Australian novels, films and plays, and map those. And so there are interesting questions we had with that around how do, say, filming locations relate to the narrative locations in film, because they're not often filmed in the place where they're set. And then this took me, we also developed a locative app from that called Culture Map, which would alert you when you were nearby a location, say from Zigzag Street in Brisbane. And this ended up taking me to QUT, where I've been doing much more sort of work around geo-social media mapping, which I'll be talking about as well, working with the large social media data sets that they have at QUT and the capacity there that they have for doing this work. One of the projects I did when I first went to QUT, and if I've got time, I'll talk a bit about this later and give you an explanation of how somebody who has no real background in any of this sort of put together, I guess, a close to real-time social media map of the G20. So I worked on this with a colleague as well, and this was the closest I came to being, I guess, a data journalist was I had to do nightly kind of social media weather girl act on Channel 7 during the G20. It was a very strange experience. So the projects I'm working on at the moment, there are ones I'm working on in terms of rapid spatial analytics and participatory geovisualization of crowdsourced data, and this is with colleagues in the Urban Informatics Lab, and these are quite applied projects looking at the insurance sector and mapping risk and crowdsourcing information about risk for the insurance sector, and also mapping information about land valuation as well, and that's working with the Collaborative Research Centre for Spatial Information and University of New South Wales. I'm also working on a couple of emerging projects, one on placemaking, digital media and event tourism, so looking at how people engage with event tourism and place through digital media, and that's also through mapping social media, but also looking at in situ kind of experience of place with digital media. And also an emerging project with a colleague who's here, Tim Highfield, looking at location, the everyday and algorithmic cultures of surveillance as well. So tonight, the points that I'll be covering are these emerging forms from a more academic perspective, I guess, and then getting into a bit of practical stuff. Emerging forms of spatial information and geodata, web mapping or neogeography tools, where these came from, the kind of historical background to it, and the ethics and limitations of working with geodata. So, back in 2011, so in recent years, Eric Gordon and Adriana de Souza Silva have argued that our increasing and increasingly ubiquitous engagement with location and locative media has led to, and I quote, an emerging form of location awareness that they call net locality. So this location awareness isn't just confined to your phone, it's with its built-in GPS and location-based services. It's also built into web services you might use from a fixed computer. So there's this notion of the geospatial revolution or the digital spatial turn, and this is framed around a number of kind of entwined emergences and technological affordances and developments. So including the development and uptake of locative media, the emergence of the geospatial web, and I'll cover these in a little bit more detail soon, the development and uptake of accessible mapping tools, which has also been called neogeography, and the exponential growth, so underpinning all of this is this exponential growth of volunteered or user-generated geospatial data, and also the opening up of open source spatial data repositories as well, and increasing interest in mapping spatial data. And this last one is particularly in relation to social media, which is increasingly being talked about as geosocial media. So on that point about the geospatial web, really this is going back to around 2000, where we get the beginning of the end of the idea of the web as a placeless space. So one of the biggest myths of the web is that it is a placeless space. So because of IP to geotechnology, since the early 2000s, it's not only been a myth, it's also been demonstrably wrong. So I don't know how familiar you are with the kind of this history, but in 2000, a French activist brought a lawsuit against Yahoo. And Yahoo was allowing the sale of Nazi memorabilia on its websites. And this was against French law, which did not allow the sale of any Nazi memorabilia. So Yahoo said it was unfair to ban the selling of this memorabilia just because of one country's laws. So Yahoo's vice president at the time said, and this is a great quote that illustrates this notion of cyberspace as a placeless space. He said, "We have many countries and many laws and just one internet." And he said, besides this, they couldn't screen users of the sites on the basis of their geography. He said they just said it wasn't possible. But the French judge disagreed. And Yahoo came back and said, no, we've tried, we really can't do it. And then, of course, the French brought out their specialist who said, not only is it possible, it's actually quite easy to do. So in the end, after fighting this in the courts, Yahoo ended up seeing the financial benefit of this IP to geotechnology and started selling it into China, where sort of setting up this cordon sanitaire around certain sections of the web was, of course, getting to be big business. So, but at any rate, since the early 2000s at least, the web has been thoroughly grounded in this way. And as digital media scholar Richard Rogers has put it, he said the Yahoo case was the revenge of geography and caused the death of cyberspace. And as geolocative services opened up further in the 2000s, those locative and grounded capabilities of the web were increasingly remarked upon. And in June 2005, of course, Google released the API of Google Maps, so allowing developers to integrate and embed Google Maps into an existing website to create mashup maps. It was opening it up to users beyond the usual confines of geographic information systems, or GIS. So early in 2005, just a few months before the release of the Google Maps API, a new media pundit called John Udell started gushing about the possibilities of Google Maps, and his quote was that he said the Google Maps would become a service factory for what he called the geospatial web, or the geo-aware web. So people had talked about geospatial applications before, but nobody had ever sort of prefixed it with this, this definite article, the geospatial web. So it became like the semantic web. And then, of course, that key moment in the emergence of what became known as neogeography, or what became talked about as neogeography at the time, was that release of the Google Maps API in 2005. So you get, from 2000 you start getting this IP to geotechnology, where everywhere you go on the web you're being tracked, or you're being, it's aware of where you are and sending you content that's based on where you are. You've got the release of the Google Maps API, and then you've also got this kind of coining of these terms about geospatial web, neogeography. So it was coined in 2006 to describe this kind of non-professional, user-oriented and Web 2 enabled mapping. It had multiple applications, from humanities to humanitarianism, from cultural mapping to crisis mapping. And so that example I gave you of the Cultural Atlas of Australia, that was a Google Maps kind of project where it opened it up to humanities scholars who wouldn't have gone and used ArcGIS to do this necessarily. And, a good example of crisis mapping was the development of Ushahidi maps around this time as well. So this was, let me just check, it was 2008 when the first Ushahidi maps was made. I don't know if anyone's familiar with this. Yes, so it was a crisis mapping. So it was, in 2008, there was post-election violence spreading across Kenya. And so there was a Kenyan activist who put out a call on a blog post asking for techies to do a mashup of where violence and destruction was happening. So people would send in information by SMS, and then they would map this on a Google map. So since then, Ushahidi Maps has become actually a crisis mapping platform rather than and providing crisis mapping services to other people. But it started out with the Google Maps moment of being this kind of opening up this kind of mapping to people who might not otherwise have used GIS. So there have also been, I should say, critiques of neogeography, especially the notion of the neo in neogeography, and that it's bound up with, consumer capital, with techno-capitalism as well. And it's also, there's nothing about neogeography that disrupts that kind of positivist gaze. They use web Mercator projection, so anyone who's kind of got a critical GIS background would know that there are lots of critiques to be made of the kind of scopic mastery that these tools put over the world. But there are quite a number of visualization tools and platforms, some which have been around for a long time, and others are more of these kind of neo-geographical tools. So there are the kind of traditional desktop GIS tools like ArcGIS, which is the industry standard. It's expensive, requires sort of specific skills and training, and there's also the open source equivalent, which is QGIS. There are also kind of basic web mapping like Google Maps, and we're getting into the neo-geography platforms here. Online services like Carto. As of a few weeks ago, it was CartoDB, but it's now just Carto, and I've got to correct myself because that's been the one that I've used for a lot of the mapping that I do. And also Mapbox and custom map design applications like Mapbox's Tile Mill, and there are many, many, many more of these. And if anyone's interested, you can, if you search on Dirt Directory mapping, it has a whole list of them, including annotations of what they're good for. I'm just going to talk briefly about the rise of geodata and location as a particular data point and a particularly sensitive data point. And I'm going to do this by making note of, and a lot of you would be familiar with this, and someone was involved with it, as I understand. So this was from a year ago, and this was an ABC story about Will Ockenden got his telco to give him all the metadata from his phone, and then handed it out to do crowdsourced analysis to say, what can everyone find out about me from this? And what was fascinating to me when I saw this analysis come back, and let's see if my internet is going to work, or my link's going to work, is that if you look at the analysis, this is phone metadata, so you would think, okay, with phone, maybe it would be mostly about the who, the question of the who. Who is this person contacting, and when? But all of the visualizations are the where. It's all mapping. Which was very interesting to me, which I think, because this was a story about privacy and about the concerns we might have about the new metadata laws, that location is a key point, or a key signifier of the concerns people have about metadata. Okay, so let's see if I can just get straight back to here. And this is going to lead me on to talking about the kinds of site where I've been focusing most of my attention of late, and that's in terms of geosocial media. So there are increasingly, researchers have been talking about all sorts of social media platforms as being geosocial media platforms, even ones that you wouldn't initially think of as having location as a key feature. But there's an increasingly geolocative substratum that underpins these social media platforms. So, there are the obvious ones like check-in or recommendation platforms like Foursquare, Swarm, Yelp, Meetup or hookup apps like Tinder, Grindr, Meetup. There are those interesting ones like Yik Yak, which is clearly a locative social media app. And then there are ones that you wouldn't automatically think of as being geosocial, like Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. There are also, augmented reality geosocial games, location-based games like Ingress and the infinitely more popular in recent times Pokemon Go, that are sort of changing how people relate to, I guess, space. There are going to be a lot of papers written about Pokemon Go, and Tim and I are going to write one, I think. Yes. But I, along with a lot of people, have been focusing particularly on Twitter, and that's primarily because it's much easier to get data out of Twitter than a lot of these other ones, and there are fewer privacy issues, which I'll get to as well. But geosocial media, or mapping geosocial media, has been of interest across a number of disciplines and domains, from geography to information science to communication, which is where I'm based. And that's because there are some very interesting things going on. So within geography, there's always been this idea, well, it's been around for a long time, this acronym of VGI, or Volunteered Geographic Information, which is like crowdsourced data for geographers. But some scholars have argued that with geosocial media data, we have to move away from this term and in fact create a new one, or AGI, Ambient Geographic Information. And the reason for this is that we cannot tell necessarily with geosocial media data whether there's a consciousness about volunteering this information. You can't say that it's volunteered in the same way that you can say somebody who contributed to say that Kenyan Ushahidi Maps SMS'd in information about a crisis that's occurring, or somebody who contributes to Fix My Street, or one of those kinds of apps. You can't say necessarily that somebody who's pinning a location on Twitter is necessarily volunteering that information with the same level of consciousness about it. It's also becoming a valuable data source as well. There are companies like Geophedia, which is on selling geotagged social media data to, say, journalists, to organisations that could do something with this data, to marketers, these sorts of things. So it's a valuable commodity as well, even though, as I'm going to explain, it's only a very tiny percentage of social media data. But there is great interest in this because there are certain promises of geosocial analysis that's interesting both for communication scholars but also people who've worked with big spatial data before. Because with geosocial media there's a focus on real-time dynamics, so this is something that doesn't often happen with big spatial data. So you can ask questions about, can you see things happening in real time, patterns happening in real time? And this notion of social media as a kind of sensor network for crisis events as well. So a lot of the social media mapping that gets done is around crisis events. There's also a sense that there's arguments that there's potential to provide new insights into the spatio-temporal spread of ideas and actions and human mobilities and human behaviour. But, like I said, there are some serious challenges and limitations of Twitter mapping. So, I'm focusing on Twitter mapping because this is where most of the work gets done. Only a tiny fraction of tweets are geolocated, and it's between 1% and 3%. But for what I've noticed with looking at particular events, if you're looking at festivals, for instance, we get a higher percentage of geolocated tweets because people are performatively saying, I'm here at this particular place. Location information can be found in the tweets themselves, but extracting this locational information poses particular difficulties. I'll talk about that soon. And there's a challenge of integrating different levels of locational granularity. So are you mapping, how far are you mapping at the suburb, the city, the street level? And I'll talk about that when I get to my example. And also the question of privacy as well. So the other benefit that Twitter has is it's like 95% public data, I think, or 95% of profiles or something like that are public. So there's a sense that people who are posting to Twitter are, to some degree, consciously partaking in a public conversation about public issues. And yet, when people are tagging their location in a tweet, that's not necessarily visible in the same way that it is once we map it on a map. All of a sudden, when you put locations on a map, data can look quite different. A good example, which comes from a book on digital humanitarians, is there was an American newspaper which published a digital map and it was called The Gun Owner Next Door. So it was taking publicly available gun ownership data that was available in kind of tabular form, and they put it on a map. So it was mapped down to the street level. And what they found from this was that people just went out and bought guns because they could see on a map suddenly that people next door had a gun. So suddenly when you put things on a map, things take a different kind of you can see patterns that you couldn't necessarily see when it was public data in just a table. So there are questions around the ethics of doing this kind of mapping as well. So this is a couple of years ago now. So this is the Mapping G20 project, and this is just showing you the final map that we did. So and explain how we did it. So I want to stress it's by no means a sophisticated Twitter map, but it's one that's managed with very few false positive matches to provide a close to real-time event-based social media map. And it required very, very few specialist skills. So what this map shows is G20 related geotagged tweets and geoparsed tweets. So tweets where we analyse the tweet text and mapped and put longitude and latitude coordinates onto the tweet text. And so it was place mentions. We're mapping place mentions in the text. So the summit across the G20. So this is from the 23rd of October to the 22nd of November. So the summit itself was on the 15th and 16th of November, if you'll recall, and there's a public holiday on the 14th. So you can see the flare up in the city around these dates. That's the 14th and the 15th, and you can see where Obama goes to UQ because everything flares up there as well on the 15th of November. So this map represents 17,500 geotag or geo-referenced tweets, 17,500, and only 1,600 or so of those, or less than 10%, were geotagged. So the remaining 15,000 plus tweets we mapped through a process of geoparsing place mentions in the tweet text. So what this map primarily shows then is the representation of Brisbane sites on Twitter during the G20. Not necessarily where people were and tweeting about the G20, but what people were saying about Brisbane sites. So we weren't mapping mentions of Brisbane, we're mapping mentions of, say, the Marriott Hotel where Obama stayed. But it had to be tagged with G20. So the way we went about doing this, most Twitter mapping projects work on kind of located events because you get more located data out of them. But often they only work with geotag data because you don't necessarily know when crisis events are going to occur before they do. The benefit we had with the G20 was that we knew well in advance where things were going to happen. We had the maps of the declared areas. And not only did we have the map of the declared area, we also had a fairly helpful kind of tag to search for, G20. You know, it was unlikely that people would use G20 unless they were talking about the G20 at this time. We did get a couple of sort of false positives where people say, oh, the meeting's going to be held in room G20, but it was, it was very rare. Most of what we captured was actually about the G20. And so what I did, and I'm sure there would be a much faster way of doing this. In fact, there are now kind of Python tools that people have developed that that will automatically attempt to extract and geolocate place information from tweet text. There's the PyGeo tool, which is has been developed. But I only had a few weeks to do this, so I made it a quite manual process because I didn't have time to find out whether I could make it less manual. So I used OpenStreetMap. And what I did was I just created a bounding box around the declared areas, and then I extracted that bounding box from OpenStreetMap. And then I had to whittle that down. So you can see there that from OpenStreetMap you'd get latitude, longitude, the type of amenity and the name, but you probably can't see that very well, but as you can see from that extract there on the right, there's a lot of stuff that I wouldn't want to map. For instance, I'm not interested in mapping that bench, So it took a lot of whittling down to figure out, what it was that I needed. So there were about 8,000 named points or locations looking at that bounding box. But the other problem also was that the bounding box was much larger. I only had a bounding box and I had to map this. So I did this by hand. I actually went through and carefully edited out all of the points that were outside that. And then I augmented the points that were inside. So I looked for locations that OpenStreetMap hadn't mapped, or that had old data, like the name of a hotel had changed, that sort of thing, or a restaurant had changed. So, and then I constructed a gazetteer, which looked like this. So I had a lot of that same information, the kind of amenity, the name, but what I also had to do was create search terms, which you can't see very well. But what I had to do was create different, like I had to look for the Twitter handles of particular places, but also and I had to imagine people misspelling things or using colloquialisms like KP for Kangaroo Point or the Valley for Fortitude Valley. So one of the things I'd done was map if anyone remembers the light festival that they had, the Colour Me Brisbane Festival, that was before the G20, and one of the key sites for that was the Commissariat store. And people misspell that constantly. So I'd already realised from that I had to think about misspellings as well. So it was very, very manual, and this is where at this point, this is where I needed a hacker. So I have to do a shout out to my former colleague, Daryl Woodford, who now works for a company called Hypometer Technologies, who wrote a Python script that then mapped, as the tweets came in, mapped this onto the tweets. And using CartoDB, as it was called then, it meant that in close to real time, we could actually map this. So the tweets came in close to real time. It read it against the Python script in close to real time, and we could serve that back to CartoDB within every 15 minutes. So it was within an hour. The idea behind this was we were hoping to see whether there were we were seeing the G20 as a disruption within the life of the city, and to see what kinds of disruptions we'd see. Because there'd been massive riots in London and Vancouver in previous years, and we didn't know if this was going to happen, and of course it didn't, and it was as much to do, I think, with climactic reasons as anything. It was just too hot. But it was interesting to see. In fact, a lot of stuff we saw were just mentions of ghost town, nobody was there. And so this is the kind of thing that we came out with, the geotag tweets. And here we can get the different kinds of categories that we had. So the anything that's outside the declared areas are geo-tweets, because we just did a bounding box. So anything, these were where people had tweeted their location as part of their tweet. But inside that, we've got the different ones. So we had different kind of confidence levels, from whether they were mentions of buildings and landmarks, to bridges, parks or precincts, to streets, to long streets and suburbs. And that's me. So I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. I don't know if I explained too much of that or not enough, but you can let me know.
Did you have any contact from police or G20 organisations themselves?
No. No, they weren't very interested. Channel 7 was very interested. But the police weren't. They would have their own social media monitoring. So there was, I don't know what they had, but there was discussion leading up to it, whether they were using something like SockMint, which is so they would have presumably much better access than I would have had to, presumably. Who knows? Yeah.
Do you know of any other good tools?
Yeah, so there are. What I also haven't talked about are the kind of digital globe ones as well. So like Cesium, but Mapbox is also used quite a bit as well, and is quite customizable. But certainly in terms of just plug and play, and also doing real time and temporal visualization, Carto is the one. It can do that sort of over time mapping in a way that I'm not aware, unless some other platforms developed this recently. I think it's the only one that does that temporal. Yeah.
Peter, I guess I'm going to ask a question that Angus was actually going to ask it, because he kind of talked about this a couple of months ago. Within trying to reference a location based on a stream, if you have someone reference Melbourne Street,
Yes.
right, how do you know it's Melbourne Street, Brisbane versus Melbourne, Victoria? Did you come up with any kind of clever workarounds or inferences about how to actually locate a tweet, or a location from that?
We didn't go that far, because we figured that if it was a mention of a street and it was talking about G20, then we would have that level of just allow that into the data set without going, because we really didn't have time. We didn't actually even have time to test it before we went live with it. It was that kind of, and it did sort of work. So we did get some sort of false positives in there. So there was, for instance, we were mapping the Marriott, G20 and Marriott, but there was some news stories about the Vancouver riots, which happened outside the Marriott Hotel in Vancouver during the G20 years of 2000, I can't remember what year it was, and there was still a court case ongoing, and we mapped a story about the Vancouver onto the Marriott here. So yes, it's not a perfect by any stretch, but I think we're lucky in terms of having that G20. Otherwise, when you're doing things like cyclones or something, unless people categorically use like TC Marsha or something, you can imagine it's a lot harder to map something where people have just talked about Marsha, Yeah.
So you weren't using, sorry to follow up.
Yeah.
But so you weren't using any other kind of data that they were providing in terms of their own location and profile where they actually report that they're residing to resolve the place name, just kind of hoping that anything captured in that would basically be.
We didn't have time to do that and to do that kind of analysis of the profile. But the Trisma project that they have at QUT is tracking Australian Twitter accounts. So if we were looking within that data, we'd have a strong sense of, well, at least it's an Australian account. But we weren't necessarily mapping just people who are in Brisbane. We were mapping people who might have been on the other side of the world talking about a location in Brisbane. But no, there's always going to be there are always going to be problems with the data, but just going through manually and looking at it, the vast majority of it was absolutely about Brisbane and the G20.
Oh, sorry, you go.
You talked a bit about people engaging with location, engaging with place. And so it's very interesting because I'm wondering if anyone's haven't got enough information yet, we can start looking at not that how people engage with place, but the other way, how we can engage them with place and location.
Yeah, well, I think this is probably going to come back to bite me. I think Pokemon Go is in some ways a missed opportunity. I think, it's got a very thin, if anyone's played, I'm assuming at least a couple of people here have played it, it's a fairly thin engagement with place through it. You might accidentally stumble upon some plaques somewhere and a bit of history that you didn't know about Brisbane by spinning a Pokestop. But, I think certainly that is a sort of an attempt to engage people more with place.
You wouldn't be surprised, say, in the next year or so that there's an Egyptian-themed Pokemon released only in the pyramids of Giza.
Yeah, there'll be definitely things like that where people will be trying to leverage from that AR
Some kind of
moment.
onion where Tony Abbott lives, I don't know.
Yes, exactly. But I think, something like geocaching, which is very old school, if anyone's been involved with that, that is definitely about engaging people with place. But so if you could marry the kind of engagement that with place that geocaching brings with the kind of gamification of Pokemon Go, I think you'd end up with something quite...
Much like Dan, I'm sorry to follow up again, but speaking of sort of geocaching, that kind of thing, gamification, has anyone been tracking augmented reality games with this kind of... Because I know that they're getting very into it. That's probably the most cutting edge field of geodata, to be honest, because they're very, very, very intense with it now.
Yeah.
Has anyone been looking into that?
Yeah, I certainly know of people who are doing, PhDs on it, but I don't know how they might get data from it. I think they're as far as I'm aware, they're fairly locked down systems. There was discussion with Ingress that because Niantic Labs, which created Ingress and then Pokemon Go was originally part of Google, that they were actually using Ingress, the data generated from Ingress, to develop Google Maps because the pedestrian routes were the weakest part of Google Maps. And they were using that. There was discussion that they were using that to bolster to Google Maps, which is an interesting kind of form of gamified crowdsourcing, if that is the case. But I wouldn't be surprised.
Thanks so much for adding that kind of history of the GeoWeb on the front, because that was really interesting. I wonder whether you could explain a little bit what the term neogeography means, or how how you use it?
Yeah, and I just use it as partly because it was part of that moment of the kind of release of Google Maps. And the way that it got used, so there's a site called Placial, which started doing this kind of user-enabled mapping. And it was the founder of Placial is often credited with using this term neogeography first. But it was really to kind of get across how these sort of new platforms, like the Google Maps API, was allowing people who had absolutely no training in GIS, who had no kind of geographical skills, to actually map things. And the first kind of definitions of it were really about entertainment, like the examples that were given in the first definitions were about people going on holiday and then putting their photos on a map, you know. So it was very much about that user, for entertainment purposes, opening it up, you know, for the masses, basically.
So moving from that kind of strict utilitarian view of mapping to
playful mapping and people and do it yourself.
Yeah.
So it had that DIY sense to it. But there have been critiques, particularly from the critical GIS tradition, which in that sense is that kind of neogeography. So Agnieszka Leszczyński talks about this. Kind of hides the techno-capitalist underpinnings of a lot of these platforms, like Google Maps, and also elides the kind of those problematic, very kind of colonialist perspectives on place and space that you get from these sort of from Google Earth and Google Maps, where you can like I said, that scopic mastery of space that doesn't necessarily bring in other people's perspectives on place. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
But, you know, having said that, I certainly probably wouldn't be doing what I'm doing had Google Maps not been released. I wouldn't have gone off and learned ArcGIS on my own, I don't think.
Yeah, it's interesting too.
Yeah. Yeah.
You said at the beginning between 1% and 3%
Yeah.
tweets were geo-located.
Yeah.
Is that, so using the Twitter API, what it left of blank, or how does that work?
Yeah, so where I'm getting those statistics from, those percentages from, there's a guy called Kalev Liataru who there's a lot of big data stuff. So those of you who work in news might know he's involved in this GDELT project, which is about big news data. But he did a project where he had access to, I think, the Decahose over a period of time, and then analyse that for geolocated data. What I can also tell you from the Trisma project that we have, which collects the Australian Twitter, it's like an Australian Twitter fire hose. In that we have 1.67% of geotagged data. So it's pretty consistent, but what I've seen is where you've got a located event that is of regional interest, not necessarily global interest, you'll get a lot higher percentage. So where people are announcing that they're in a place for a particular reason. So.
That seems really curious to me because the way I experience using Twitter is like I'm very aware of that function of Twitter, and I imagine a lot of people aren't. But I turn it on and leave it on because like I'm fine with that and I've thought about it. And I imagine it's so low because the default is turned off and most people will never turn it on and never think about it.
Yeah.
But if it's higher at specific events, that leads me to think that people are deliberately, periodically turning it on and off.
Yeah. And there was a Pew Research study from a number of years ago that looked at location sharing and found that younger people were much more aware, much more location aware, and would turn off and on their location tagging for particular, for when they wanted to. They were much more aware of it than older users as well. So yes, it does suggest that people are doing this. And there's also the option to tag a place rather than turn on your geolocated tweets, which is still a small subset of it, but it's a growing one as well, where you can pin a location. So that's using the places.
Yeah, the interface of Twitter is really deceptive if you look at the amount of data that you get back when you use the API. it's actually very rich.
Yeah. So you can get some interesting stuff out of there. But again, it's a if you're just looking at geotag data, it's a thoroughly non-representative sample of a non-representative sample. So I'm just saying that to cover myself that I'm totally aware of that.
Just on that, I saw an analysis today of Trump's tweets which differentiated between what they think he personally tweeted and his aide, because they could tell one was posted on Android and the other was posted on.
Oh right, yes, which would be a very simple way.
They also did a natural language processing to assess narcissism or something. And there was a distinct difference.
Between that. So what platform does Trump use?
According to the article, he tweets mostly in the morning on an Android platform, and his aide tweets after midday on an iPhone, and I'll let you guess which one is more narcissistic.
That's very interesting.
And he also doesn't use email,
Oh, I see.
so the whole thing is...
I think Bill Clinton's the one that said he doesn't use email, but his wife has a private email service.
Yes, I know.
That's another issue.
Yeah.
Just wondering if you've looked into the Google, obviously if you've got an Android phone, Google keeps a list of exactly where you go all the time.
Yeah.
And it's actually really good, and I help it along because I quite like it. I quite like knowing where I was 3 days, 3 days ago at 2:30.
Yeah.
Have you, and so for the police, but is that something that you've looked at? Is that something that you've
Not currently, but it's something that I think Tim and I are going to be doing more research on, more of that sort of digital ethnographic research. So rather than looking at kind of big data stuff, or alongside looking at big data stuff, looking at how people engage with or location aware through locative media. So, I get it freaks me out still when my phone says 15 minutes to Kelvin Grove right now in the mornings. And I'm like, you know where I'm going better than I do. This is just frightening, and that kind of algorithmic sense of location is something that Tim and I are going to be working more on. But that will probably involve much more kind of ethnographic style research where we talk to people, rather than just harvest their data. Yeah.
And just you were talking about Pokemon Go and those types of use of geolocation. There was a very clever piece of geolocation called Hackney Here, which is a app that you download. You walk around Hackney, which is a suburb in London in the UK, and it plays you stories about where you're standing.
Oh right,
so if you're standing in front of a house, all of a sudden in your headphones it says, "Oh, so and so used to live here, and this is what happened in this particular house." So it's a really, really nice way, quite hard work, I would imagine, but a really nice way of telling stories about a particular small local area.
Yeah, there are some nice kind of cultural heritage, augmented reality type projects like that, and there are other ones where you can hold your iPad up in a street where there was a film, and it'll play you the clip of the film that was there, so you could sort of see it there. So and History Pin does those sorts of things as well. So yeah, there are some really nice and I think maybe if we could blend those kind of rich cultural heritage type projects with those sort of more gamified, that you could get, I don't know, something a bit more interesting. I love playing Pokemon Go, don't get me wrong. I just wanted a bit more kind of actual place engagement.
On topic of storytelling.
Sorry.
Isn't social media kind of the death myth? In that, it's kind of hard to look. We have all these mythological figures, or not mythological figures, just historical figures we look up to, like Churchill and that kind of thing. And I think Churchill would be much less impressive if you knew that you could go back and scroll through his Twitter feed, and you knew that when he was stuck in a traffic jam on Monday morning that he tweeted this guy as an asshole in front of me, or when he was.
We lose the mystery, you mean?
All the mystery mystery is probably the word for it.
Yep.
That gets eventually immortalized into myth, we don't forget the terrible parts. That's gone now, pretty much. When the next generation of figures, like historical figures, grows up, when they're dead, we'll have well, not us, we'll be dead too. Our forebears will have their entire history, almost from birth, at fingertips.
Though it is still particularly with public figures on Twitter, it's still highly curated unless you're, the Trumps of the world who lack a filter.
Becoming aware
Yeah.
of presenting an image.
But that's kind of the point, though, because you have to become a figure unless you're born into it through whatever reason your parents were.
Yeah, so the
girls on Instagram,
I don't know
they
Instagram.
present an image.
I get you. Do you mean like the digital legacy? That the born.
You have to become a figure.
Yeah.
So if you have to become a figure, there's surely going to be some point like where you have your baby pictures up there or something silly.
We should get Tama Lever to get. So there's a colleague of ours at Curtin University who works on precisely this about both about kind of birth and Twitter and death and birth and social media and death and social media and these kinds of questions about. Sorry.
Digital undertaking.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, right. The other side as well. There's a whole digital presence of you that's going to accrue likes and pokes and retweets that you'll never ever. Died.
Yeah.
Before you could ever return them. I don't know where I'm going with this question.
Yes, it's alarming, these kind of digital traces that we're leaving everywhere.
Dissolved into existentialism.
Yes.
I can say one thing though, and that due to the magic of geo-tracking, I just tracked that driver of pizzas. It's just gone the wrong way.
There you go.
Wayne, who's apparently his favourite pizza is Hawaiian, and he listens to Eminem. He's on his way to our door right now, so we've got time for probably one more.
Well, there's someone up the back who's just missed out. So.
Forgot the question. One of the, I suppose, spectacular fails of geolocation and big data, I guess, has been Google Blue Trends. So
Yes.
that would seem to be one of the most plausible things you can imagine. You geolocate a whole lot of searches
Yeah.
on a pretty big platform like Google.
Yeah.
You put a machine learning back in.
Yeah.
That didn't work. Do you think people are more random? Like, than
People are still trying to do that.
Yeah.
They're still trying to do it. They're still trying to recreate,
it seems like
do contagion maps with.
An awesome thing. Like
Yeah.
a friend of mine who remained nameless showed me the other day in Google Trends. If you search for a hot gymnast, there's this strange 4-year periodicity on it. And so people do search for things at certain times.
Yes.
I
Yeah.
don't know. Do you see that in your analysis that
Yeah.
you get a hypothesis? This has got to work. This has to work, and it doesn't.
To be honest, I haven't looked into. I've deliberately not tried to create any hypotheses because I'm aware of what I'm doing is just so. Again, I'm looking at a tiny subset of discussion about particular things. So no, I haven't, but I'm aware of those sort of failed experiments. But I'm also not somebody who goes after totalizing ventures. I'm having come from the humanities. I'm happy looking at a small thing and doing. But it is interesting that people are still trying to, it's almost as though, they're seeing that Google Flu Trends, maybe it would still work with various other, if they tweak certain things. So people are still very much interested in doing that, even though the Google Flu Trends thing itself was a failure. So, but I don't know enough about that to be able to say anything, definitive about it or logical for that matter, and I've just trailed off into lather. So, yeah.
I've got one more question, if I think we do. You mentioned right early on that you're sort of looking at surveillance and privacy as part of your research as well. Can you tell us a bit about what you're working on in that space?
Yeah, so that would be, again, about how people, so this is again with Tim, a project that we're still developing, how people become, how location aware are they, how they become location aware. So again, that would be, I imagine at this point, because it's still in its infancy, much more about that kind of ethnographic style research rather than big data research. But certainly we're interested, but also just generally in questions about, like with Pokemon Go, suddenly everyone got very excited about Pokemon Go, and then there are all these news stories about who's harvesting your data. Google wants your entire, back history and all access to your entire account. And this, so how people,
as if they don't already have it.
As if they don't already have it, yeah. And I guess even questions about the census, because it's got which has happened since then. These, how people think about their locational privacy and their locational awareness, and how sensitive is location becoming to them, because I think it is. People are much more interested in keeping that private.
Excellent. Well, thanks very much. Wonderful. I really appreciate it. And before we dig into the pieces, I just wanted to mention as well, Dan and I are starting the process to kind of formalise an organisation to run this meetup group. And there's a sort of core group of people that I've reached out to and asked them to be members so that we can get that process underway. And we're going to be meeting again after this meetup. We're just heading over to Charming Squire to have kind of a minuted meeting where we resolve to set up an organisation. And if anyone else in the room is interested in kind of putting their name down as a member of that organisation and kind of having a vote in whether or not Dan and I are allowed to run the thing, you're welcome to come along afterwards as well. We're trying to aim for about 9 o'clock over at Charming Squire. But until that happens, there's some food and conversation and some more drinks to be had. I'm sure Peter's going to hang around for a bit if you've got any more questions you didn't get to ask. And that's really it. I think Dan usually orders some
There's a
veg.
gluten-free one down here, there's a vegan one here, that way inclined, always catering to the dietary concerns.
All right, how about it? Thanks very much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. That was excellent.
No, thank you. That was so good.
Child milk has been discontinued.
Oh, has it?
Yes.
It's past you, sorry.
There you go. You can see that I have not too distant future been on maternity leave.
Yeah, you notice.
So normally, this is Hacks Hackers, so is it mostly about programming technology?
So, well, okay, so I mean, the focus of it, the name comes from hacks as in hack journalists and hackers as in technologists. So the idea is to be fairly broad, but we discuss the intersection of those two broad topics. So definitely science is an area where I think those topics intersect. You know, a lot of science is very technical, and even social science is very data heavy often, and there's definitely hints out of that science. So there's definitely an intersection there. But yeah, basically around that intersection. Yeah. So thanks for coming along. Yeah.
Kind of those names.
I'm Simon.
Sorry.
That's all right.
Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Dan was, in one of his questions, referred to Angus, who was one of his students who was also presented here. So yes, that's really where it came from. And where are you from? What brings you here?
I work at Western Power.
Oh, right. So, so Sam from Hub for 101 mentioned that someone from Western. Cool. Excellent.
Also, I study science and journalism degree.
Right. So that's right.
It gels pretty well.
That's perfect. Yeah. Awesome. So how long have you been working at Western?
Yes, and do.
This is how bad it looks like.
What month is it? August?
Yeah.
Like 8 months?
Yeah, okay.
Maybe longer?
Yeah, cool. And you live in there as
No,
well?
actually,
North of Mitchelton.
Oh, right.
Which is about
Yeah, fair enough.
fair
enough.
for
Student life.
we did a lot of the drone stuff. With
I'm just going to duck to the
the
toilet, but yeah,
before,
good to meet you. Yeah.
So they're kind of moving into drone stuff now and identifying damage through that, but crowdsourcing that. And then the sort of Tom Rod stuff for the MH17, you know, those kinds of stuff. Yeah, so good to meet you. And sorry, your name was?
France.
Oh, it's nice to meet you.
Very interesting.
Oh, thank you very much. That's good. A bit concerned.
One thing I was wondering, so the first animation you showed of the tweet locations,
Yes.
it clearly resembled the grid.
Yes, I know.
What's the surrounding area?
There would have been, because to be able to put it in the frame,
Yeah.
it made it just look like it was all on a grid. But when you zoomed in, it's.
I mean, it looked like so in the 3D scenario, you had gotten hold of the coordinates, but in the process of getting it back to a location that was around it, and now it's like it was half a kilometer, 1 degree is 4. So I was just thinking that perhaps there was like 34 decimals on the left one.
When you zoomed in, it was bang on. So I think it's what CartoDB does, what Carto does when you zoom out. So it doesn't look like that when you zoom in. So I'm not sure, but thank you. I shall look into it. There's quite probably pilot error involved as well.
I was just going to say, so is your based at GUT research group?
Yes. Yeah. So yeah.
How many people in the group are doing?
Probably in the group proper, probably about 10 or so. So it's a digital media research group, and a lot of them work on social media, but also on kind of more just digital media. So do more of that ethnographic research.
So it sounds like they're doing a bit of software development.
Yeah,
They support that. You do some software. So,
well, not myself. I rely on people to do that. So with the group I work with, I don't know if you know much of the Australian Research Council grants. So they have what's called a LEAF scheme, which is a large an infrastructure scheme. So we actually got a big infrastructure grant to build. To build infrastructure for doing social media tracking and analysis. So that's what TRISP is, the tracking of infrastructure for social media analysis project. So it's paid for a whole lot of developers to work on that and build tools for Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter.
part of that 10 or they?
They're on top of it, so yeah.
Oh, okay. So
Well,
there's quite a budget.
well, that's funded through that project. So the centre itself doesn't have a budget. The individual researchers involved with it, and we bring in grant money to it. But it doesn't have its own sort of budget line in that sense. But the other people I work with in terms of doing the participative visualisation, they work in urban informatics and into they do more kind of human-computer interaction and participatory design. And, so for me, kind of doing the more theoretical kind of stuff and relying on people who actually have the sort of skills to help.
I was curious about we didn't seem to know what the police are doing. Because I sort of assumed that police, particularly the federal police, I'm sure various political groups are their own analysis because they've got an agenda.
Yeah. I tried to find out, and there was there were media reports that they were meeting with the people who developed software after the social media intelligence. And this was after the London riots, the London G20 riots, but the police would not even deny any of this, you know. So, but certainly they would have had their own analysis.
Yeah, well, they expect them to be at least at the
Oh, yes.
of analysis of their police.
And they would have
They're the
been,
federal police, they should be monitoring this stuff.
and they would have been looking for huge, hot topic words, which we weren't. We were just trying to collect everything and look for how people were experiencing G20 and talking about Brisbane during the G20. But we were looking then after that at discussion about disruption and those sorts of things, saying about leaving Brisbane.
Have you or do you know of others who have done natural language processing?
We haven't, but I am now we're seeking funding through the Institute of Environments to do more semantic space mapping. So looking at, because they find so this is kind of from science and engineering capacity. They find when they go out and do original work, or they do workshops or surveys, whatever they're trying to do gets totally derailed by some local issue they're not aware of. So they want to mine both local news and social media to identify regional kind of clusters of, and do that with semantic space mapping, identify the messages that are out there, and also use that to create messages that mediate that.
Oil and gas expo, I think that's coal seam gas expo last year. One of the keynotes speakers was Martin Wolfer, and they have a social media group that, among other things, monitors because the coal seam gas companies are very intense, very localised bodies of that against them. So they had a service where they were both monitoring that and some kind of interaction with people on behalf of the law companies, really between the lines of what was saying. I think they were service really derail these things for the corporates without it being obviously as long as you pay us money. And I was like,
Sounds like the same thing, but with less sinister overtones.
yeah, well, whatever.
I think about it, I couldn't have been more pregnant.
Oh.
Changed just then. I'm from my PhD, I like exploring text analysis and this sort of stuff, and this analysis of public discourse. My main target is that you should use that gas.
Right, well, it's like we're just like a tag team.
Yeah. I'm dance student. I want to dance student. Yeah.
Yes, I only know you from photos.
Right. Who says hello?
Yes. So I used to teach my job.
Right, but I came out of anxiety and stuff. So I didn't have any business. And pretty early on, having done a bit of GIS in the past, I started saying, oh, I can map this data. So before I even knew what GIS was, I was mining locations and kind of map them. Went through the same process you had, like, is it automatic later?
I started experimenting very quickly found out the vast majority of people don't share tag. And then started looking at research companies, all of a sudden they came to very competition sort of thing to solve. And also know that the trend is discussed people tend to go to say that they want to say they're in a certain event, they don't want people to know where they are. And that was interesting. One of the most interesting papers I read was talking about where you can work out where someone lives because inevitably they'll tweet about stuff in their city on a regular basis. And then you can go, okay, most of the time they're talking about stuff in this geographic region. Most of the time, so obviously they must spend most of their time there.
Yes, yes. So you can do that time.
But you have to like store the Twitter over a period of time to do that. You pretty much guarantee there'll be firms out there doing exactly that.
And that's something that you can now do with TRISPA that I was talking about, because it's an Australian fire host, it's an ongoing one. So they've identified some legitimate Australian Twitter accounts. Well, there will be kind of sustainability impact, but this has been funded by an Australian research council. So there's consortium of universities that are, so I don't know what your background is.
Mechanical engineering background, not currently developing skills and trying to work out whether I just go commercial programming, go and do a PhD or whatever I do. So I'm not currently a student.
No. Yeah, so it's kind of limited to the consortium of universities with money. But it's tracking it to the first 2,500 tweets of all of those 2 million accounts, and it's tracking all of them. So
there is a data
historical data, yeah. So for some people, 2,500 tweets would be a week's worth. For me, it's like 2 times whatever. So it's kind of more in line, but not necessarily but it is being tracked on a multiple basis, so you can then do that kind of longitudinal sort of stuff, like look at this account, and from everything they've tweeted, identify where they, what they're talking about, that sort of thing. But with your, if you are interested in what's the person who's doing this, and it may or may not be funding, but Nancy has to do it. And she's in mathematics, so mathematics
Right. At the moment, I'm in my experiments in PhD now, but basically where I got it to is I combined the mapping. You mentioned semantic space mapping.
semantic space mapping.
Yeah. I was my topic one, and now I've got the named entities as well. So I'm basically experimenting with mapping the topics. So you say, where is this topic being talked about most? And you generate dots or heat map or something, and it works. You can see the hotspots for the topic is there. And you can see that time.
Map the network on, like, do the topological network mapping on top of that to see how the network, to what extent does the geo map onto the network to those kinds of things,
it's good to see that there's other people doing this sort of stuff. I've got a blog. I was thinking that it's a bit out of date because I've been quite busy.
I had a silly question. You had 3 mapped out areas. What was the one at the top for G20?
Oh, that was the airport.
Oh!
So there was so the airport was a declared area, and they brought in EQ at the last minute, so we had to rapidly, like in a day, chuck that one in there. So thankfully, there weren't too many streets or whatever on there.
And you said you were deliberately pulling out those that were in the square but not in the mapped area?
Yeah,
but geotagged.
Yeah, so the geotag, because...
Oh, not geotagged, the locations.
The geopaths ones were just going into the declared area, so I only looked at locations that were inside. So it was tricky because sometimes you've got long streets or you've got 2 vulture streets or whatever, so there were those sorts of problems.
2 vulture streets?
No, are there 2 There's one...
Oh, no, I wouldn't know.
No, there's a street...
There's 2 boundaries. There's many boundaries. There's heaps of boundaries. Probably 2 in.
So it's like, what do we do with 2 boundary streets? So it's and in the end we just had to just assume there were going to be errors. And maybe people probably weren't going to say boundary street, which is really obvious. But we just thought, get it all in there, just in case some serious riots break out.
That's fascinating about the Vancouver.
Yeah,
you'd think it was so niche, married to
G20. That'd be a data Obama. No. Vancouver G20.
Are you from around here?
Yeah, well,
at the moment?
Yeah.
Okay. I think it's UQ that holds the Bris Science.
I don't know. So,
just 2 weeks ago, they had their latest one, and it was to do with geography and basically geospatial systems and how to use them. I'll come back.
Here in Brisbane, I can see the flames in the distance. When you have some intelligence,
Is technology changing? Kobe is actually but she was talking about using social media to advise urban growers about existing land use. And she did a thing on botanic gardens the last 72 hours, and like that's what her company does. So it's very overlapping. You're right. That's what she was saying too. So she, yeah. She said she died into positive and negative. And like in the catchphrase version of negative, dark, snake, things like that. And yeah, it was really interesting. Well, that's right. Exactly. That's what if I saw it, I'd be like,
Yeah, that's why I'm a really good type of
well, she tried to convince us that she'd done a reasonable effort at pointing out what's satire or irony or whatever it is.
Yeah, but
Yeah, right.
hard to scale it up because CSIRO trying to get puzzled by about transitions like automatic gender sentiments these people are feeling
A lot of it's like popular science. I'll let you go.
Hey, Peter.
There's new friends and make sure that it's do those friends we know they're my age, but they're just the two who's like a 75-year-old man. So like those people can figure out is there from there to someone else you can get to pick someone else. Pretty happy with that. I know that.
Yeah, Dan's still selling us. Apparently, there is subject to a lot of buttons, and so that has feedback.
I heard about it when it happened. Oh, that's awesome.
Never followed up.
So they were trying to
So basically, the idea is that if there's a disease we have to research so you can monitor that to check outbreaks or.
you have to be good at it because someone just typing in, like you saw where it's flying everywhere, everywhere was searching what is flying, what are the symptoms. Yeah, so you've working on it, like you really
It's not people paranoid.
yeah, it's like you're actually, what you're actually tracking is counting. So you have to learn.
So you have to get really specific combinations.
Yeah.
Yeah, you got to compare what sick people type of
Sick
people obviously are getting sick. Hospital, you know.
So they actually have like real-time water level data, right? But they get people to tweet in information as well, right? So that's from it, like people sent photos in, right? Yeah, so that one's kind of on the way up. So
what is it? People tweet.
like they've got real sensors out there, but people are also sending actual on the ground photos of where things are happening, events are happening. Oh, I can't read Indonesian, right? But yeah, there's water there. You can see water.
You tell me what I can do with the
Yeah, so confirmed locations of flooding as reported by Jakarta residents using Twitter, Clue, and DTIP.
So if you go to their Twitter account, can you see what someone tweeted?
Yeah.
It's down in the contact across.
Oh, yeah.
I got that.
Yeah.
So you've got to enable geolocation to see. Yeah, so it's like here's some flooding, do something about it. It's interesting. Peter actually means map, right? And this is not lost on Matt like Peter's map, right? And Peter does geolocation. How awesome is that? Yeah, it's in Malay or yeah, it's pretty cool.
I was thinking because it was about drones, I remember very into like my control airplanes and water drones. I was so used to that. It's like this is exciting. Like I knew about this.
Well, super excited because
True.
we were just talking at lunch to one of the there is a who's down started making buildings really
As hard as I can.
that's his whole
Alright.
yeah. He's trying to get super stable so and then he's got one, so they're trying out all this stuff, so it's kind of like hair sensors. Actually, no, I think the idea is not finding things, but to pick up vibrations.
Yeah. And I guess it's like close like the pressure would change. Pretty comfortable at the moment. No, it's just nice. I don't know, I say that maybe another year, man.
And I was like, I had no. I like the idea of you just feel that. Blow dry or something. Blow dry.
And feedback at the moment that all of these courses arts and big ideas. And I think it's like partly the art/music department at UQ, but also translational research institute. It's actually translational research. I still don't know exactly what that is. Yeah, but they're having they've had a couple of people have these talks, and one of them was these two artists to use some, I don't know neural model, but just basically they found a paper where the person in the paper had the MATLAB code to simulate neurons, and then they sort of built a way to sample audio from locations to so it's kind of, it didn't sound nice, but it sort of just sound. And they just sort of different mixture of art and sort of sound. But there was one, it was last week, and it was an explosion of Chopin, so the pianist composer. And he was just, the actual topic of it was pretty hard to digest because he did this as he's a professor in Cambridge maybe, and he did this just lecture to his students, but to just a broad range of people going to this free event. And he was such he was a very sort of characteristic kind of English professor, down the line, very sort of dry humour. But he dedicated his entire life in terms of just researching Chopin. He created, I think he's nothing like the eminent experts in the field. Created an entire resource of every single kind of version of Chopin's was around. So this was the original copy that went to the German publishers, or this is the original copy that went to the English publishers. Here are the little differences, and he's trying to work out the intention to see what would Chopin wanted to play, or what was he actually thinking. And he'd play examples, and one of them was just a single note change, so it was a G sharp to a G natural. He's just I heard a pianist play G natural, and I nearly fell off my seat. It was just kind of amazing, the kind of passion for one sort of person. It's probably I don't know what I could do with that.
And I mean, it's a small thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I get emails about the secret companies. For example, that happens right now. That's
feel like everything I do is I can relate to that more than like, this experiment that no one said I'm studying their take on this particular topic. Unless the problem is not being popular.
Yeah, you just like the QMS research. And you're just like on a level where you're like, two people know how to do this.
One of my friends did a PhD at QMS, and he got to the end of it and went, there's literally 3 people there who are capable of understanding those features, and 2 of them examined it, and I've sent it to the other one. What have I done with my life? Like, so depressed. It's nice to be working with you.
Yeah.
One would hope that.
Which means that he's now an expert in psychology and There's probably more. Yeah, there is.
He's got one. He's still not.
Don't worry, guys, we can unknot it. I worked it out.
I like the biggest story in recently is Japan has come up with a proof of some age-old conjecture. He's come up with this proof for it. This person has never claimed that. The language he's working with, it's all so obscure and so personally developed. No one else in the world, a few years, has actually been able to verify what he's done. So they keep holding like conferences and workshops because he's this sort of reclusive guy. And other people have this invest years of their life to just understand. Yeah, this is used.
Yeah, with the last sort of huge breakthrough, I think one breakthrough. But one of them took 10 years for someone to verify the proof. And how terrible would that be? If you're that person, it's like, I know I've proved it, hurry up. Yeah. But it was like at 10,000
It's mostly simple statements. It's amazing that the simple statement, A squared plus B squared and C squared it's amazing that such a simple statement can require these incredibly complex proofs.
That simple statement the conceptual mathematics
they're conceptually straightforward. Like the statements are such that a 10-year-old can understand it. Sometimes. Like that. There's a book about Hermes last year.
Yeah.
And it was something along the lines of it's a straightforward statement involving
quadratic basis, which I don't think.
it's basically a bit like Pythagoras. That's all it amounts to. In terms of complexity, it's like if you have A squared and B squared.
So it's did you ever do long division?
I was trying to work out how to do it.
So I'm pretty sure that plus
must be the complex way of saying it. Yeah. The book stated in a way that
it was pretty
very straightforward statement. But to prove it, it's years and years and years.
It's like, yeah, with something like P equals N, it's very easy to say.
That's hard.
It's very hard. So people figured out a very efficient way of saying it. That is the nice thing about finding hard problems that everyone agrees is hard. Then you have a good justification for like, well, I'm working on it. Everyone agrees.
I'm sure a lot of but
It's always proved useful. It's just inconceivable ways of trying
it's part of the bigger puzzle that chances are becoming useful for someone.
It's like, I guess anyone that's worked it, who like probably did it before doing things like those linear operations and doing that would have been like, that's never going to use that. Yeah. Shit, has anyone done the work for this?
I'll search stuff. I know when I put something on Facebook, it's on Facebook. But when I search on Google, it's just like,
Stopping doing that.
After you're not doing it, integrate. I can do that.
It comes back to all the stuff.
I had to. Alright. I still got it. Oh, yeah.
You mentioned long division. Literally, it's in Caroline's art. The guy has like minimum over maximum. So they got like 9/20. It just looks like a division problem. I just want to get a visual.
So what you do is you start with the digits. So let's just say you do
I spent 20
9 into 220. Go 9 into 2.
Yeah, like, I see it as a process. I looked up two things online, and all they do is say, do this and that, and it works really well. Like, your example is like really close to there. But I just there's no conceptual reasoning to it. It just says, do this and then do that, and my brain just says, yeah, completely. I gave up figuring out how to try and
I was in a user run, so I was terrible. So I always just did it on the vision, so I kept doing on the
vision's a calculator.
Yeah, or doing it just doing it. And then, but I was better. So I kept doing it. And then we had to do it. Then I could remember how to do it, and everyone else was going along with it.
I remember once, like, when I was in high school or uni, and something explained mum would break out the long division on the whiteboard.
Well, sure.
So I was going, oh shit, I can't do that.
All you're doing is breaking it down into its parts. So if you're dividing 9 into 3,000 twice 4, so 9 into 3,000 and then 9 into 4.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Taking account of the difference. But the process itself is process.
Yes. It must be a lost art. Yeah, stop teaching us, unless they've gone back and said,
it's a formula. Like, it's
there are people in the population who have exactly.
Yeah. It's
oh,
like even But I can start watching it. You've got parts of stage that you just learn this process.
That was what we were together.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. And I find that our biggest beef is that it's on one side, so see engineers and scientists so fixated on technical solutions, and realistically, engineers has to be talking about, doing all technology beyond functionality, like, what is political, it's communication, Alright. Yeah. Really aware of it. I saw it. That's essential. I mean, this is interesting. So the idea of technology erasing doesn't have to print to make it paper, right? So it's a niche that technology solves. That's where I'm working at. That's why and then of course you it wasn't saying my job is bad, it was saying just the recent one is
But yeah, so that's
Yeah, so that's nice.
Up for election, yeah, that's right. So why are you?
I nearly asked the question. I mean, what's the limit liability?
It's basically so we have a bit more, I guess, management around like accountability, but also so we can have an ABM build it. Right. Okay. So yeah, currently the sponsorship we've got so far, I've been doing that my personal. That's basically. Yeah, I'm going to have to take them upstairs, but just, in stacks of 4 or 5 would be good. I'll take them upstairs. Yeah.
Just, this is yours, isn't it?
Oh, that's mine.
Oh, it's yours?
I'll just put it over here.
Yeah. Not bringing stuff around.
Oh, it's still at your wrist, yeah.
Yeah, still another.
Really?
Yeah, well,
Is it still feeling ginger or no?
I feel too bad, but I went last Friday and then I go, all right, I said I can't see it, but I come back and said it's not wind. Does that make sense?
Well, yeah.
But I had spent too much time with computer programming as an scientist. And yes, I do understand what that means. It means there's no evidence that it's not wind.
Yes. Making an assumption.
That's right. Or else.
Our live stream didn't work tonight. Disappointed me a bit.
And you had the 360?
Yeah, it seems to have lost connection to my computer at some point.
Right.
Oh, well. How you been, James?
Yeah, I've been good.
Yeah?
Been good.
Been travelling again?
No, but I am in a couple of weeks' time.
Okay.
I'm actually, this time last
had no voice whatsoever.
Oh, really?
So yeah, completely lost my voice.
Just
It was a little bit
cold or?
Yeah,